Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Qwynn Galloway-Salazar. Qwynn, welcome.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you so much for having me on this Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? I think
today is a Tuesday. Yeah. And you're very welcome. I'm excited you're here. So Qwynn is an Army veteran, an end-of-life doula, educator, and founder of In Their Honor, LLC. Throughout more than 2 decades of dedication to enhancing the quality of life and well-being of military and veteran communities, Qwynn has acquired a deep understanding of how military experiences can have long-term impacts on one's life and the lives of loved ones. Her passion for serving those who've served their country is reflected in her work. She deeply understands the unique needs and challenges that veterans face as they approach the end of their lives. And she's committed to raising awareness and implementing initiatives to address these issues. Once again, Qwynn, welcome to the podcast. Before we get going, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
So I am originally from New York City, born and raised in New York, and wow. I currently live in Georgia. Okay. Night and day difference, right? Night and day difference. From the East, moved to the South, kind of like the slowness of the South. So I've stayed.
Okay, awesome. So how did you get here? How is it? This is what gets me. How is it that you and I are sitting down here right now and talking?
Yeah. Oftentimes I get that question, and just being totally candid, when someone says, what do you do? And then I tell them I'm in the end of life space. You can almost see people kind of wanting to retract that question because it's like, what Pandora box did I just open? Mm-hmm. It's been an interesting journey. For the last over 2 decades, I've been serving in the space of service members, veterans, and their families, particularly in the space of behavioral health. And I was working in 2021, I was finishing up my PhD, and I was working on my dissertation where I focused my study on post 9/11 women veterans transitions. And several of those women shared the trauma that they experienced, whether it was combat trauma or military sexual trauma that they faced while they were in service and how it impacted them along their life journey. I found myself at that place, Guy, saying, okay, how does trauma and how does one's military experience show back up throughout the course of life, especially at the end of life? And as a society, what are we doing about that? What type of existential question did I have, right? And in the midst of asking myself that question, I asked it to my mentor. And at the time, one of my closest mentors, her name was Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas. She was living with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. Kate knew she was dying at the time. And I asked her those tough questions. And we set forth this journey of, well, Qwynn, what the heck are you going to do about this? So I did my research, and Guy, I stumbled across a role that was called an end-of-life doula, or for others, they may know it as a death doula. And I said, sign me up. I became a death doula. and I started volunteering my time in hospice. And before I knew it, what I thought would be just a passion project in my community started becoming a movement around the country for those that were saying to themselves, wow, what are we doing? What are we doing in our communities? How are we showing up for caregivers and their loved ones? And as healthcare providers, how are we doing this work, interfacing trauma, but also caring for ourselves along the way? And in a nutshell, 2 years later, I've had the great opportunity to partner with an organization called the Psych Armor Institute through a generous donation to create a series of courses specifically focused on caring for veterans through the end of their lives.
Wow. No, seriously. I mean, so amazing. And you're so amazing and such an intense topic. So where does your military experience come in?
Yeah. So my military experience comes in dead smack in 2001. So I enlisted in the Army April 2001. I'm probably going to date myself, but when I joined the Army, the last major conflict, I was in the third grade. And so surely in my mind, I thought I can do my enlistment time unscathed. Within 2 weeks of getting out of basic training, 9/11 happened. And as I shared in the beginning of our conversation, I'm from New York City. And it changed the trajectory of my life. I was a criminal justice major in college at that time. In 2003, I was called up to active duty because I was a reservist. I was called up to active duty, and I supported efforts at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, supporting service members that were deploying to the Middle East. And boy, did I learn a lot there. I served in finance, but I also served in postal. And while I served in the postal service, that's where I heard the stories.
Oh my gosh.
That's where I heard the stories of enlisted members and officers share their worries and their concerns about deploying. But that was also where I heard the stories of soldiers that were coming off of active duty, who completed their tours of what it was like to be in theater.
When you decided on the topic for your dissertation, were you thinking trauma? Is that
I was not thinking trauma. While I was completing my dissertation, actually, I was serving as the co-director for SAMHSA's and the VA Service Member Veterans and Their Families Technical Assistance Center, where I focused on suicide prevention, right? So my work world was immersed in trauma. Whereas my PhD, I wanted to focus on veterans entering into the civilian workforce. But
hold on a second. More specifically, what were you thinking? Entering into the workforce and what else?
Entering into the workforce and how organizations could support veterans that were doing that transition and supporting them in the workplace. How can we set up, peer groups? How can we set up professional development, mentoring, networking, all of those things that can help with ease that transition from wearing that uniform to entering that workforce, right? Mm-hmm. Because I experienced a challenge when I got off of active duty. I didn't know what in the world, right? Like it just, serving in uniform and serving as a soldier is completely different than working in the civilian workforce. And so I always wanted to go back to that. Mm-hmm. But little did I know, doing that work and doing that research, it would lead me down a whole nother trail to see how trauma does impact someone long-term, right? It was just a magnificent experience. And to journey with those women veterans and to hear their stories, because oftentimes as women, our story, we feel invisible. We feel overshadowed by our male counterparts, and just giving them the space to share gave some of them the opportunity to share a part of themselves that they never had the opportunity to share. For some, it gave them the opportunity to have closure that they never had the opportunity to fulfill. So that was just a wonderful experience through and through. And for myself, it caused me to close that loop of my journey as well, in understanding that for me to be able to do the work that I'm doing, I had to have some of that lived experience to have a full understanding of what my fellow women veterans were going through, and veterans as a whole.
So you were interviewing these women?
Yes.
How were you doing that? Was it over Zoom, in person, or?
It was over Zoom in the middle of the pandemic.
And share with us some specifics about when things started to shift for you, when you started to say, oh my gosh, this is maybe heading into a different direction for me.
Yeah. So towards the end, right? So I would say when I was going back and I was listening to all of my recordings and I was pulling out themes, and I started to see similar themes as it related to trauma. And that was the point where I started saying, wow, right? We spend a lot of time in the space of veteran service organizations focused on, post-traumatic stress and suicide prevention and trauma. But how far do we go with looking at it along life's continuum, right? And is it because that there's such a stigma as it relates to death and dying that we really don't touch that point along the continuum? And what do we do?
So what did you start to do? How did things unfold for you?
So I finished my PhD, my dissertation.
Congratulations on that.
Thank
I mean,
you.
crazy.
I know you know that journey, right? I know you know that journey. My dissertation chair said, Qwynn, I know you want to solve world peace, and I know you want to save the world. Finish this dissertation and then go do that. Right? And so that's what I did. I finished my dissertation, and then I really jumped in feet first in the end of life space. And I started companioning. My very first veteran that I companioned with was a Vietnam veteran. And Guy, I'll never forget when him and I began meeting, one of the first questions he had out the door was, why do you want to be my friend? Do you have any idea what I did? And he had these really hard questions that he would ask. Maybe the first to third, maybe fourth session, that was when we got to this breakthrough. But I tell people all the time, I had to pass muster. I had to pass the point where he felt like we built a strong enough rapport where he could trust me, where he could show up and be his full self, be transparent and be vulnerable, and know that I wasn't going to leave because I heard something hard. And he shared with me what it was like for him when he came home and how society did not welcome him home, how his family struggled with just the challenges he faced with his trauma, and how he struggled with his own trauma, which caused him to isolate, which caused him to lose significant relationships across his life. And I remember one particular day sitting with him, and he said, well, how long are you going to keep showing up? And my response was, I'm going to keep showing up for you as long as you have breath in your body. And then I'll keep showing up for your family.
Jesus.
And it's been that way. That was my first, and I've had several after that. But now I'm to the point where I care for one veteran because my work it's almost like I'm doulaing end of life professionals who are doing this work. I'm doulaing communities that want to show up and do this work. And that is beyond my wildest dream. I literally just wanted to show up at the bedside to allow a veteran to know they are not alone at the end of their lives.
It's one thing to do a dissertation and experience experience how the knowledge unfolds and your direction shifts and think, okay, well, wow, I've discovered this. There's a need here. I'm going to focus on end of life. And it's another thing entirely to do it. What made you feel or know that you could sit with people during that time? It's a joke. A lot of people listening are going, thank God she's doing it. God bless her. But that is intense. It's scary. It's scary for a lot of us.
Mm-hmm. It is. I was a little girl and I had a neighbor that lived across the street. I spent my weekends in Long Island and I lived this city life during the week. And on the weekends, I had this suburban life. And at the time, there was a famous child author by the name of R.L. Stine. And R.L. Stine wrote horror stories for children. And my girlfriend that lived across the street, her name is Stephanie Scott Andrews, and it's okay that I share her name. Her and I came up with this game guide that one of us would play the decedent and the other would play the mortician. And we played that game. We were maybe about 7 or 8 years old. Death and dying has always intrigued me ever since I was a little girl. When I got off of active duty in 2004, I did a short apprenticeship in a funeral home because I considered going to mortuary school.
Wow.
Unfortunately, because of the stigma attached to death and dying, I did not have the support that I needed for me to do that at the time. And so I put it on pause until the pandemic. I mentioned my girlfriend, Stephanie, because what's very interesting is I ended up becoming an end-of-life doula, and she ended up becoming a hospice social worker. So I say to people, I didn't choose this work. Mm-hmm. This work chose me.
What is the difference between those, a hospice worker and an end-of-life doula?
Yeah, so working in a hospice as a social worker, that social worker is there to provide resources and supports whatever's in the community for that veteran or for that patient. That social worker is kind of like that point person that family can go to. Say, for instance, they're trying to figure out, well, what are the benefits, right, that a veteran can receive? What are the survivors' benefits that they can receive? Where should internment be? That hospice social worker can loop that veteran's family or loved ones to wherever those supports are. Of course, as a social worker as well, they're also ensuring that, mental health, is being addressed. They're also ensuring pain management is being addressed. The symptomologies, all of that, they are that person that goes back to that care team and says, this is what's going on for that veteran. This is the needs of that veteran. And they all come together as a care team to provide, hopefully state-of-the-art care for that veteran. Whereas that doula shows up as a companion. And I share with people all the time that doulas show up in various ways. You have many doulas that served in hospice or palliative care as docs, as nurses, as social workers. You have doulas that have been administrators. Where they come from varies, but they have this heart to companion. They have this heart to companion with the dying. They have a heart to say, during that 11th hour, so that 48-hour window of time when we know that someone is actively dying, you have a doula that can sit and be present with the dying to support that family, to educate that family as to what is happening, right? There's this book as moms that we get, what to expect when you're expecting.
Right.
But on the other end of the spectrum, it's kind of like a veil, right? that doula is there, similar to a birth doula that's there to support that family and that mother to midwife through birth. That doula is there on the other end to journey with that person that's dying and to journey with that family to be of support.
So you founded In Their Honor LLC. Talk to us about what that is and what you do there.
So I founded In Their Honor to work alongside and to consult with communities, states, and organizations that were desiring to build something called a compassionate community. And a compassionate community is a community that says we acknowledge that we have those that are aging, those that are seriously ill, those that are facing life-limiting illnesses, and we all know that we have a role in this death and dying space, and we're going to figure out ways to show up and do something about it. So I started In Their Honor to do that work, to create, to have, strategic planning sessions for one with communities to do that work. And what would it look like for an urban community? And what would it look like for a rural community to stand up a coalition or an initiative to address these needs and to implement it? Where In Their Honor lies now is partnering, once again, to still partner with communities, but now it's more so inspiring communities to do this work and to raise awareness. I've had the great honor of partnering with many of the doula organizations through international at this point. Wow. To raise awareness about the unique challenges and the unique needs of veterans that are facing their end of life. And so it's almost like I had someone say to me, Qwynn, this is not just a moment, you've started a movement. And that's huge. So everywhere that I go that I can educate people on end of life, I do. And yes, indeed, Guy, my work is really focused and centered around veterans. But I often, a colleague of both of ours, Mary Ellen Salzano, we talked and she's like, you're the death conversationalist. And I'm like, I'll be the death conversationalist because there's a reality to that. It is a part of our human experience. It's often the one human experience that we're never prepared for.
What you mentioned, the unique experiences of veterans during that time. What are those? What are some of those?
So thinking about post-traumatic stress and how, those triggers, or rather activators, show up at the end of life. Someone may have deployed, let's talk about Vietnam, for example, deployed to a combat zone, experience just the brutality and just the violence that occurs in combat and comes home with that. And sometimes we don't diagnose it. Sometimes they never seek treatment, but it shows up at the end of life, right? It may show up as a moral injury or a soul injury. It may show up as survivor's guilt. And for some of our veterans, they may have never shared their experiences with their loved ones. And now that they're facing this existential moment of dying, some of them have regrets and unfinished business and the need for forgiveness and shame that they've carried for so many years and guilt that they carried. So those are some of those unique experiences that we can find some. Of course, there's trauma within our civilian population, but specific to the military culture lies those challenges, right? And how for many veterans, that stoicism, that battle mind, that is kind of just ingrained in who we be, right? Shows up. And how can we be there and show up and hear those experiences and hear those stories and try to work with veterans to find peace? Can't say closure, but some form of peace. That same veteran I shared the story with earlier that was in Vietnam, one of the things that we did, Guy, was I had him write a letter to his younger self. Didn't read it. I didn't read it. I had him write it. And he burned that letter. And just the mere fact that he had the opportunity to get his feelings down on paper after all of those years, there was something, just the ritual of it, there was something cathartic within doing that he felt a sense of release. He felt a sense of, okay, for this moment, I can move forward and put that part to bay. And so it's that where when I have the opportunities to share that, right, and thinking about providers, because I know primarily that's the audience that will listen. I had a chaplain share. I was doing a workshop in Michigan a few months ago, and I had a chaplain share, put your clipboard down. As professionals and as providers, we want to know what the pain is like. We want to know the admin piece. We want to know the medical piece, but we forget that there's this person with these lived experiences. And sometimes the greatest medicine, the greatest treatment plan starts with just being present and listening to their story and listening to their experiences, having a conversation with the family that may have secondary trauma because for years they've walked on eggshells because of their loved ones, their veterans' trauma. So I can't say enough how important it is to just sit for a moment and listen to that story, listen to where that veteran has been. And you have some veterans who feel like their military experience wasn't a major, experience in their lives, and that is fine. Offer them the opportunity to just have you hold space and listen.
Put the clipboard down.
Put the clipboard down.
What's been surprising for you as you started doing this, as you started gaining more experience as a doula?
Yeah. What's been surprising to me, and this sounds so silly, I thought more of this work was happening across the country. And when I talk to caregivers and loved ones, and you'll often hear me separate the two, using the term family, not all veterans have families, right? Some of them are separated from their families and have lost contact with their families. So I'll use the term loved ones interchangeably because a loved one may be a neighbor that's caring for that veteran. I thought we were doing more in our communities to show up and be compassionate. But I realized
for veterans specifically?
For veterans specifically, and for just being neighborly, period, right? But what I realize is we don't know what we don't know. And oftentimes, when someone is dying, we will say, you tell me, or someone has died, tell me what you need. In those moments, we don't know what we need, right? All we know is that we need to breathe and and we hope to keep one step and one foot in front of the other. I realize that as a nation, we need to have practical strategies, practical ways to say, this is how I can show up, right? I may be able to show up to Sergeant Joe's house and give his wife respite care so she can get out and get some fresh air. I may be able to show up to Sergeant Jane's house who, has cancer now because she was exposed to burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, but she has a 12-year-old son. I can go take her 12-year-old son to the park, let him run some energy off, play some ball with him, have a moment where he has the opportunity to realize that in the midst of his family challenges and the grief that's anticipated with his mom's death, that he's still a 12-year-old boy, right? And we can be there to support him. So I find myself in this space, and I'm starting to see it happen in other communities too, where people are saying, what are the practical things that we can do to show up and to support and to hold space with veterans and community members at large? But because my work is so specific to veterans, but veterans, how can we show up and be there? And I'm grateful for that. I tell people all the time, which Qwynn do you want, right? Because oftentimes people say, Dr. Galloway-Salazar. Well, Dr. Galloway-Salazar practices heart work first. That's my first line of duty is heart work. And then it's the head work, right? I look at the research. Of course, I look at the research. But for me, it is showing lay people how they can show up. They're not looking at the scholarly articles that Guy, you and I look at to stay abreast as to what's happening, what evidence-based practices or best practices are happening. They're not reading those things. Mm-hmm. So how can I take those things that I read and make them so user-friendly that my next door neighbor knows how to show up and hold space in a capacity that he feels comfortable? If he's a barber, maybe he can go over to Sergeant Joe's house and cut his hair, give him a shave, give him that dignity that he knew was a part of who Sergeant Joe was in life.
Wow. As we wind down here, Qwynn, no, seriously, it's just, it's so moving. It's just so moving to talk to you. I mean, you're obviously someone who is so passionate about this work, and it's let's say the word intense, and I think that's when I can't find a better word, but we as a culture still run away from this topic.
Yeah.
A lot. It's hard to talk about, and yet you seem to have not just walked into it, but dove into it. It seems like this is what I do. Yeah. This is just who I am.
It's who I am.
It's who I am.
Mm-hmm. And it's an honor. It's an honor. It's my version of second service. Right. It's an honor it's not my job, it's my vocation. I feel like it's passion, it's purpose. It's hard work, but it's heart work. And every opportunity that I can journey with a veteran or a family or a community or an organization, that's my way of saying thank you. Thank you.
So, what's the best way for people to reach out and contact you?
So I think the easiest way to reach out and contact me is probably my website, which is intheirhonor.info. Okay. There is a contact me or a contact us page there. Feel free to fill it out. It comes directly to me. I answer every response every request that comes through that page. And if there's a way that I can support, if you're a provider and you have questions, what are the questions that, we ask the dying that are appropriate? I'm all open. I'm totally open to coach and to provide guidance as you journey and as you navigate this end of life space.
Awesome. Qwynn, so amazing talking with you. You are definitely coming back here. I'd love to have you back. Just really inspired by what you do. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.